So much happening in our province this week in the world of politics. We got our premier connecting himself to the Oscars. We're going to talk about that, as well as the feds coming out with their climate plan. Here to discuss it and break it all down is our legislative reporter and correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, thanks so much for joining me today. Great to have you on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Tyler, lots going on. As we all know by now, there have been changes made to the way the United Conservatives are holding Jason Kenney's leadership review with the switch to mail-in ballot instead of in-person voting in Red Deer, where some 15,000 people were already registered.
That's right. Yeah, they'd expected considerably fewer than that. And sort of by the cutoff date of March 19th to buy party memberships, they had about 15,000 people register and had expected, another 5 or 10,000 more to register to come down to Red Deer. So basically, the party's line is that it was, unwieldy to be able to hold an in-person voting day. In Red Deer in the facility they had rented, because of course it all would have been done with paper and pencil, and people would have had to count out the ballots at the end of the day. So they basically said, look, this is just not doable, and so they've moved to mail-in ballots, which will go to every member of the United Conservatives, not just those who registered for the leadership review. So it's about 55,000 is what I've heard. And then there'll be ID requirements and a return mailing envelope and all these things to get the votes back into an auditing firm, which is going to handle all that. So the big thing that's happening here is that no longer will we know the results on April 9th as we would have if it had been done in person. So it'll now be like May 18th, I think, when we finally find out whether or not Jason Kenney is going to stick around as the leader of the party. And this change, of course, has been hugely controversial, with Kenney critics saying that this is, moving the goalposts, changing the game to benefit Jason Kenney. Kenney's people saying that, no, this is a logistical matter. So, even if the news was announced a week or so ago, it is certainly going to be a topic of conversation among partisan conservatives in this province for a few more weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Way to stretch it out too. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Now, Tyler, there have been some reports that Kenney has privately alluded to the fact that he could just give up his spot as premier and retire to a private life. Do you think that this is really something he would do?
No, I don't really think so. There was some chatter that he'd had some of these conversations around Christmas time, sort of hashing out what might happen, if he decided to step back from being premier and step back from politics. But, he has said that, look, I could quit politics tomorrow and, I'd have my evenings back, I'd have my weekends back and all this stuff. But in this recording that was leaked to media, CBC broke the story. He basically said that the attempt to oust him as leader was sort of from these fringe lunatics, and that the UCP is a mainstream conservative party, and he wasn't going to give up the fight and let sort of this fringe take over the party. So that is, he's hinted at that a little bit. In some of his sort of public comments, obviously talking about there being fringe elements of the party that supported convoy protests and things like that, whereas his government was sort of trying to knot and thread that needle. So, but it's still very interesting that he would have come out and said that to staff, sort of casting it as a fringe versus mainstream sort of battle. So it'll be interesting to see what reporting comes out in the next few weeks as ballots are counted and this thing keeps going on.
Very interesting indeed. Okay, let's turn our attention a little bit to federal politics here. So the federal government comes out with their climate plan on Tuesday. A very ambitious plan, I might add. It estimates that the oil and gas sector will need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 42% by the year 2030 in order for the country to reach its climate targets. But this plan is being criticized.
It is, and nothing creates unity in Alberta politics like the Prime Minister's government doing something. So that's what we saw on Tuesday. We had both the New Democrats and the United Conservatives sort of slamming this plan. Jason Nixon, who's the Environment Minister, came out and said that this plan is insane. It's a direct attack on the oil and gas sector. And Rachel Notley, took a similar path. She said this is fantasy and it's aspirational. It's not a roadmap to actually get this done. So pretty poor reviews for the federal government's climate change plan from Alberta politicians. And I guess we'll see what happens with that. Obviously, at this particular moment with the war in Ukraine, sort of Alberta's oil and gas products are sort of popular, maybe more popular than they have been in previous years, and the government's really trying to capitalize on that. So it's very interesting timing, I think, for the federal Liberals to come out with this climate plan when there's all this other stuff on in Alberta politics.
Yeah, no kidding. And like I said before, ambitious. I mean, it includes a schedule to shift to electric vehicles, promising that 1 in 5 new passenger cars is going to be battery operated within 4 years. Are people just kind of thinking this is unrealistic?
I think that's probably the case for some things. I mean, taking a look, for example, at the oil and gas sector needing to cut emissions by 42%, as you mentioned. I mean, the oil and gas sector makes up for something like 26% of Canada's overall emissions. So, that's talking pretty big cuts. And it takes time to switch over infrastructure and these sorts of things. And that's sort of what Rachel Notley was alluding to, saying that, this is maybe a doable objective, but, on the sort of timelines we're talking about, the costs of these things, it might not be possible. But yeah, I mean, on the electric vehicles thing, it'll be interesting to see what happens on car lots in the next couple of years. That's for sure. Maybe everyone will be driving electric F-150s in a year or two. Who knows?
I don't know about that, but yeah, wouldn't that be interesting to see? Let's switch gears here one more time. So this is something everyone's been talking about this week. It's the slap heard around the world, of course. Will Smith hitting Chris Rock on stage at the Oscars. And apparently, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney got in on this. So what's that all about, Tyler?
Yeah, so people may have seen the meme sort of going around that shows Chris Rock being slapped and Will Smith with sort of his hand blurring through the air towards him. And Jason Kenney was like really quick out the gate, or at least his people were, because they posted a meme on his Instagram account at about midnight, the night of the Oscars, and it was labeled, Chris Rock was labeled green energy policies, and Will Smith was labeled reality. And so that was sort of noticed first thing the next morning by reporters, and Kenney was asked about it. And he's standing by it, saying, it was a modern communications tool to make the point that he thinks green energy policies have failed. And of course, his critics saying that this is, sort of a tacit endorsement of violence, perhaps. So, a little bit of an Alberta angle there to the slap, as you say, that was heard around the world.
Okay, so Tyler, this week the UCP has introduced a bill that will overhaul the oversight process for continuing care services. So what they're doing, I guess, is creating one bill that will replace 6 pieces of legislation, some of which date back way to the 80s. So maybe talk a little bit more about this, Tyler.
That's right. Yeah. So obviously, continuing care and palliative care and, this whole sort of umbrella of care services for elderly people have been very much under the spotlight in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. And as you mentioned, as it turns out, this system is sort of regulated by 6 pieces of legislation and 6 sets of regulations. So it's pretty disconnected, I suppose you could say, set of rules around these facilities. And a report had been done last year looking into the system overall and what could be changed, and it made a number of recommendations, and the government has sort of adopted those recommendations. And so this sort of overhauling of the legislative structure and the oversight structure and the accountability structure is sort of part of that process. And it's actually another small example of bipartisan sort of unity in the legislature, because the New Democrats are essentially on board with the idea of overhauling this. Now, their concern is that this doesn't do enough for workers and working conditions and things like that, which is, of course, part of this, larger issue in continuing care homes. But it'll be very interesting to watch how that folds out. And, I should mention that, even before the pandemic, this was a thing that was a major topic of conversation in parts of Canada. Ontario, for example, prior to the pandemic, went through a big sort of soul searching, I guess you could say, about elder care and had looked at reforming their system. So, pandemic or no pandemic, I think it's probably fair to say that this is a long overdue look at the way that elderly Albertans are taken care of.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding that it's going to increase fines as well.
Yeah, so it'll basically increase fines, maybe up to $100,000 for operators who violate these rules. That number is sticking in my mind here. So yeah, there's sort of there's the regulatory part of it, but then also the accountability part of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Tyler, the carbon tax is set to go up by 3 cents on April 1st, but Jason Kenney introduced a motion in the legislature this week condemning the hike.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I think it's going to do anything. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is probably not going to back down because the Alberta government is upset about the carbon tax hike, as it has been since it was elected. But it's a notable thing because in the context of everything going on with Kenny's leadership, in the context with his sort of relatively low approval numbers, both within the party and outside the party, he does need to sort of have a few sort of red meat policies for his base or gestures for the party base to remind them that he is still a conservative and is still on their side. So I think you can look at this as part of that. And the other part of it is, of course, that Jason Kenney is philosophically opposed to carbon taxes, and so is his government. So that is happening. And then the other thing that is sort of happening in context here is that April 1st, when the carbon tax increase comes into play, bringing it up to, I think, 12 cents a liter, that's the same day that the Alberta government will be dropping the fuel tax for diesel and gasoline. So that should bring a little bit of relief at the pumps. They announced that maybe 3 weeks ago now. So essentially, the way the government is framing this is, we campaigned on canceling the carbon tax, and by eliminating the fuel tax, we're, sort of balancing out the carbon tax in that way. Yeah. So,
it's like, just
it'll
kidding.
certainly, yeah, exactly. So it'll take that out of it. Of course, we'll have to see what happens with prices that are, totally outside of the government's control.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting that it's April 1st too. Aren't they calling it an April Fool's joke or something?
Yes, that is what Kenny called it in his announcement of the motion, an April Fool's prank, he said.
There you go. All right. So, Tyler, Alberta will establish an office to combat human trafficking. So this is one of multiple recommendations from a task force that the UCP is moving ahead with. Can you maybe talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so this task force was, it was headed by Paul Brandt, the country music star, who's done a lot of advocacy around human trafficking, and they'd sort of been looking into the incidents in Alberta and the sort of government structure around it, the policing structure, that sort of thing. And the panel reported back over the weekend, I believe it was, with I think it was 18 or 19 recommendations, and sort of the main groupings are that to create an office of human trafficking, to have sort of messaging and education programs that are universally standardized, have better data collection across the province. Things like that. Tyler Shandro, the Justice Minister, formerly the Health Minister, of course, that also changed a few weeks ago, basically saying that, this is a well-hidden crime in Canada and in Alberta. And the police say there's about 31 incidents of human trafficking in 2019 is what their statistics are. So perhaps that is very high, perhaps that is very low. I mean, I suppose it would depend what you compare it to in terms of other crimes. So that was sort of the panel's recommendations. The government has accepted them in principle, as they sort of tend to do. Now, the one they didn't accept was a recommendation to change Alberta to an opt-out organ donation system. So, instead of signing up to be an organ donor, everyone would be signed up to be an organ donor, but you could opt out. And they sort of rejected that, saying that, and the idea behind this was to try and make Alberta not a destination for organ trafficking, which sort of doesn't seem to be all that big of an issue, is basically where it comes down on that one. And I think also probably the UCP would have a little political hurdle perhaps on that one, because conservative governments tend to be a bit skeptical of opt-out organ donation.
Ugh, there you go. Okay, so let's looking at Edmonton here. So Thomas Dang, elected as an Edmonton New Democrat, is under investigation for allegedly hacking into the government's vaccine records. So Tyler, what's happening with that?
So this was an announcement maybe a month or two ago now that the Dang was under RCMP investigation for hacking, essentially, and accessing personal health records. And I don't believe he's been in court yet on it, but he posted on his website a week or so ago this sort of big document outlining what he did and why he did it. And essentially he was arguing that he did it he'd heard that there were security issues with the government's COVID-19 vaccine record system. And so he'd sort of plugged in, I believe it was Jason Kenney's birthday to try and, prove whether or not this issue that he'd heard about was true. And as it happened, he ended up getting someone else's COVID-19 records, not Jason Kenney's. And so he basically had argued, this was what's called white hat hacking. Not hacking for any nefarious reasons, but to sort of show this IT issue. And of course, the UCP have condemned him for that. But a couple IT security experts over the week or so have basically said, look, there clearly was an IT issue here, and maybe the government should take that a little more seriously. So that's kind of the two sides of what's going on with that one.
So, Tyler, there's been a little bit of pushback on, it looks like the government's scrapping a controversial plan to make people pay a $150 fine within a week to fight a traffic fine, basically. So if they get a traffic ticket, they can pay a $150 fine. So what is with the pushback to this?
Yeah, so the system basically was condemned as sort of a runaround on the justice system. So you get a ticket in the mail, or you get pulled over and get a ticket. You'd have 1 week to pay a $150 fee, and then you would go to the sort of online adjudicator to argue over your ticket, as opposed to sort of traffic court and all those other things. And so the idea was basically to free up court and police resources for other more serious matters. And there was like a really, really substantial blowback to it, with people saying, look, this is an access to justice issue. Why should people be having to pay to fight a ticket that they've been given, and so on and so forth. So the government has actually backed down on that. And the NDP basically calling it a victory for drivers, saying that, this was an access to justice issue that has since sort of been rectified. So, we've talked a lot about like the coal policy that the Alberta government suddenly changed a year or so ago. And this and had this like massive unintended blowback. And this was, I think, another one of those that just they went ahead with it, and just people were shocked, and they've now had to backtrack a little bit.
Wow, lots happening, of course, as we said before. Tyler, we are out of time, but thanks so much for joining us once again today.
Thanks for having me.